So we're going to move on to talking about the assessment and the marking of the performance grades now. Performance grades are out of a total of 150 marks, just as with ABRSM practical grades. I mentioned 4 pieces or songs. Each of those is marked out of 30, again, in the way that we're familiar with, using the same marking criteria as for the practical grades. Namely, an assessment of control of pitch, control of time, control of tone, sense of shape, and sense of performance. Those 5 areas, or ingredients of musical performance. So that's 4 sets of 30 marks. That takes us to our maximum of 120. There's 30 more to go, and these attach specifically to a new aspect of assessment, the performance as a whole. So examiners will turn to a different set of criteria and award these 30 marks, or award the performance as a whole out of a maximum of 30 marks, using an assessment focusing on communication, interpretation, and delivery. So another way of looking at that on the right is the pie chart of pitch, time, tone, shape, and performance, providing us with the individual lens which we use to assess each of the 4 items in the programme. Then as an examiner, we step back, the playing or singing is complete, is finished. We turn to a different set of criteria and we consider aspects across the whole performance, the performance as a whole. We consider aspects of musical communication, musical interpretation, and musical delivery. And that's the way we arrive at the final set of 30 marks, giving a total of 150. So here are the marking criteria expressed in the attainment descriptor matrix mode. So along the top, you can see pitch, time, tone, shape, performance, and down the side to the left, the various levels of attainment: below pass, pass, merit, distinction. So in a way, you can dial up a descriptor for, say, performance, or for tone at merit or at distinction, a very helpful tool to understand how the exams are assessed, but I think also a really useful tool for teaching. I think this should be in the hands of candidates who are preparing, so they understand the way that they'll be assessed. And to be clear, no column is in priority to others. We consider, when we're arriving at the marks, each of those 5 aspects of musical performance. Moving on to thinking about the performance as a whole, and you remember I said that that's marked using a completely separate, different set of criteria from the ones we just looked at. First, though, I'm just going to focus on a couple of things that are in the syllabus for the performance grades. It's a performance-focused exam, so clearly the choice of repertoire is important. And attention should be given to the way the pieces are contrasted, the way in which they're presented, and the different moods and characters that they inhabit. And I'll go on to talk about this in a bit more detail, but that's an important aspect of an exam which focuses on performance. So what does that mean? Well, that should enable candidates to demonstrate their ability to deliver a coherent and convincing performance event, a sense of occasion. It isn't a set of tasks that are unrelated, and nor is it just a series of individual pieces, played one after the other. And in order to arrive at an assessment of those areas, we turn to the criteria for the performance as a whole. And that's what I want to look at now. So here are the marking criteria for the performance as a whole, laid out in the same way as you saw the pitch, time, tone, shape, performance criteria. But of course, 3 columns here: communication, interpretation, and delivery. And I'll go into each one of these in a bit more detail. But these are available, and I'll show you where you can find those on the website at the end of the presentation. But again, the familiar format of left-hand column, below pass, pass, merit, distinction, the notional mark bands attaching to those levels of attainment. And then across the top, the areas of consideration, the criteria which apply to the performance as a whole. And similarly, you can find a box that matches a merit for interpretation or distinction for communication. And of course, again, forms a really useful tool, I think, for understanding the approach to this part of the assessment and sharing that understanding with those presenting for the exams, candidates. So when we assess the performance as a whole, taking into account the totality of the performance, think of taking a photo on your phone, an individual shot. You can then change the setting, on many phones anyway, to panoramic view. And what does that do? Well, it kind of steps back and it stitches together a range of perspectives, putting together a panorama. It's kind of like that. We're using a wide angle lens. We're stepping back. Everything has finished. We've heard all the playing and the singing. So it's what can we say after the performance is complete, which we wouldn't be able to say during it. And of course, that's going to involve words like consistently or overall or throughout. I mean, if we're listening to the second piece, we can't use the word throughout the program. We're not there yet. You see what I mean? So it's specific to a consideration that can only be made after the program is complete. I'm going to say partially for most of the performance, in the first piece, in the faster movements, all those sort of thing that you might be saying as you walk away from a concert. You would probably be thinking about the entirety and pulling out examples of things which you're applying across. So to be clear, the program choice itself, in other words, the 4 pieces or songs, they're not assessed as a quality of program choice, but the musical outcomes of that choice are assessed. We've had concerns about the quality of the video recording, that maybe this would impair the communication, the quality of the communication, or it might attenuate the tonal range and things. Please don't worry about that. Even if the video recording is not the same as it would be live face-to-face, the sense of performance under this set of criteria can be communicated clearly, and certainly we can assess it reliably. So examiners will address each of the 3 criteria headings, communication, interpretation, delivery, in terms of how they manifest across the entirety of the performance. That's how it works. I now want to go into considering each of those 3 criteria for the performance as a whole in a bit more detail. So first up, it's communication, which of course is fundamental to performance. That a performance is a musical communication. Now, a helpful way to think about this is perhaps you and your listener. It's about you, the performer, and your relationship with your audience, with the listener. And of course, in some ways, for a performance grades, you could say, well, that's actually a video camera. But nevertheless, behind that, of course, the examiner is your listener, and it may well be that there are other people involved as well. So you and your audience, it's about how you project a sense of musical involvement and commitment, how that reaches out. It's about the commitment behind what you're doing and the sense of conviction behind it. It's also about how you transition from one piece to the next, or one song to the next. It's about the pacing of the program. For example, if things are too compressed and a beautiful slow movement isn't given time to rest, that there are frames to be put around it before we move on to the next piece, that could be a bit of a jar where sensibilities aren't quite at ease. Equally, if there's an overlong pause between pieces, that could feel unnatural too. That could start to undermine the sense of continuing performance. So it's about performance awareness and control of those parameters. And to be clear, in a practical exam, that does not apply. Each item is separate from the others. The examiner will say, would you like to start with your pieces, or would you rather start with scales and arpeggios? Or would you like to go on to your 3rd piece, or would you rather do the oral test? Now, in that sense, it's not a concerted performance. It's not a sequence of controlled events in the hands of the candidate. So that's quite different. And looking at that in a bit more detail, you and your listener, well, I mean, who is your listener? Who are you imagining? Who in your mind, in your intention, who are you playing or singing to? I think that's an important question to think through. How do you create a sense of occasion? I mentioned in the syllabus the notion of a performance event. How is that something that we can create? How do we make it come across as something beyond another run through? It's about the purpose and the intention. What am I trying to say? What communication do I want to come across? What expression, what motivation is behind this particular interpretation of the piece that I'm playing? And how well does the playing or the singing come across? I think that's the fundamental question about communication. How well does the playing come across? How well projected is the singing? And of course, there are various ways to explore which you can enhance that facet of communication, and they're very instrument dependent, specific to the type of instrument, what you do on a violin, what you do when you're singing, what you might do playing the piano. There are various possibilities to consider. And again, not really applicable in the same way to the practical grade exam. And I've got here a quote, an extracted sentence or two, which comes from a comment relating to the performance as a whole, specific to communication. So I'll let you read that through. And I hope you can see there's reference to commitment, there's reference to involvement, there's reference to personal response. All of those are aspects of the performance, and also reference to the way that the items in the program were paced. Moving on now to thinking about interpretation. And if communication is about you and your listener, interpretation is about you and your music. You could say you and your composers, the musicians behind your music. It's about stylistic realization, understanding what the sound world and the musical meaning and message of each piece is, and characterizing that comes across to the listener. It's about balancing your awareness and understanding of music with the interpretative demands of the program that you choose. It's got to be music that you do understand, preferably music that you understand a bit more than just the piece you're playing or singing. Is it a movement from a sonata? Is it a song from a show or an opera? Is it a piece that has others? One becomes for that, and perhaps a suite of character pieces. These kind of things are important for understanding how to interpret the music that you're playing. So it's about awareness. And in more detail, that's about awareness also of the role that you're playing. So your role in the texture. Are you the solo line, or are you accompanying? Or is it ebb and flow? If you're playing the piano, is it contrapuntal music and your hands are working with each other? Or is it melody in the right hand and accompaniment in the left? That's what we mean by awareness. Are you interpreting the music in a way that shows that awareness and control of balance and blending and ensemble? And that's whether you're playing a solo instrument like keyboard instruments, or whether you're playing with an accompaniment on a solo line instrument. So they're facets that are important to consider in terms of interpretation. In the syllabus, again, it says candidates are encouraged to interpret the score in a musical and stylistic way. It reflects what I've just been saying. So what is your musical role? What is your character? If you think of it as a play, what do you want the movement to be from item to item? How do you see the character and the mood of each of the individual pieces? Important to think those things through and how they relate to each other. And that perhaps will give a steer towards which piece should be first and which piece should be next, and what's best as in the third slot, and what should be your last piece. And of course, that doesn't have to be, the fourth piece doesn't have to be the own choice piece. The own choice piece can find its way into the program at the best place for it. It's about developing some sort of musical narrative, some sense of flow of ideas that make sense to you as a performer, so that you can interpret that and communicate it to the listener. It's about the level of your musical understanding and insight, such that you can meet the demands, the interpretative demands of the pieces of songs that you've chosen. And it's important to understand that the interpretative decisions that we make, and as soon as you play the first note of a piece, some decisions have been made, and you're choosing tempo, you're choosing the sound that you want to make, you're choosing the dynamic level. And of course, all of those combined contribute to the musical outcome. And that's what the examiners will be assessing through this panoramic lens. And there at the bottom, there's another comment, this time pulled out from a different performance as a whole comment. And this is addressing the aspect of interpretation. So again, just let you look through that and see how it connects with what I've just been saying. So just to pull out the key points again, things like stylistic realization, ideas, moods, and reference to the program as a whole, pulling out detail to do with one or other piece, second and third pieces, for example. So that's an example of how this is expressed on the mark form. So thirdly, we have delivery. And I think in many ways, this is the aspect of performance that perhaps is most familiar. So this is to do with you and your instrument, you and your technique, you and your resources, your instrumental resources. So you have a relationship with your listener, you have a relationship with your music, but there's also this relationship with your instrument. And how at ease is that? It's about technical assurance and control, not in one piece or two pieces or three, but across the whole program. There'll be technical challenges in that program. There might be some fast music or some very high quiet notes to be played, all sorts of different challenges. And it's about making sure that the challenges you choose to bring to the program are a good match for your particular instrumental or vocal skills, your technique. So it's about managing the instrument. And of course, it's also about awareness and command of the performance situation. If you start to go out of tune, perhaps a string needs to be retuned. Have you noticed that, or you just carry on? And maybe perhaps your voice is beginning to dry up. Do you take that opportunity just to lubricate the larynx so that things are going to be more relaxed for the next piece? Or if you're changing from one instrument to another, and that can happen, perhaps a different recorder or a different clarinet, have you made sure that the second one is in tune? Have you thought all of these aspects of management, instrument management, through? And that could even be the particularities of a given piano. Maybe it's got a slightly clunky pedal, or perhaps there are one or two notes that are a bit stiffer. How well are you managing the instrument? You know, that is part of performance, and every instrument has its own demands. So thinking about those in a bit more detail, you and your instruments, the program planning is quite important here, because of course stamina and physical resource and mental focus, it's one thing to play one piece, but to keep that going at the same level all the way through a 4-piece program is quite something. And thinking about the sequence and planning the pieces that you intend to include is a really important aspect of getting that right. What are the preparation strategies behind being able to sustain a performance, a continuous performance of 4 items? Well, there are strategies that I'm sure many of us can think through, but it isn't the same as preparing for isolated sections in a practical exam. So thinking about those strategies, how do we get towards reliable, comfortable, sustained delivery is very much an aspect of the preparation for this assessment. It's worth thinking about the accompaniment. I mean, you may, I suppose you're a violinist, you may think, I'd like to play a solo piece. Well, where would that solo piece best go? Do you want it middle, at the beginning, the end? How will it best suit your technical delivery? And how will it showcase what you're able best to do on the instrument? Equally, if you're being accompanied, what is the best way to manage that? And how are you going to prepare and be aware of what's going on in the accompaniment to make sure that, in terms of some of the aspects we've talked about, for example, balance and blending, to make sure that you're aware of all of those and you deliver them well. So this area of the criteria is thinking about optimizing technical ease and control. And remember, again, it's not just in one of the pieces or one of the items, it's looking across the entirety of the program. And here is an extract from a performance as a whole comment about that. So there you can see reference to control of tone across the program, thinking about where the technical delivery was at its best and where perhaps there were areas of reservation, slight inconsistencies. They're the aspects of delivery that the examiner is talking about here. But talking about instrumental control and management towards the end. And again, throughout the program, thinking about the entirety of all the pieces. So now I've got a series of 3 complete performance as a whole comments. Again, I just want them to be illustrative, because I know there's probably more uncertainty about this aspect, this component of the performance grades, the performance as a whole. So I thought perhaps a pass comment and a merit comment and a distinction comment would all be helpful to see and to read through. And you should find in each of these comments, not necessarily in the same order, but reference, as I said, to communication, interpretation, and delivery. So that might be a slide to pause on or go back to.